محمد وآل محمد.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه نستعين إنه خير ناصر ومعين ثم الصلاة والسلام والتحية والإكرام على سيدنا ونبينا أبي القاسم محمد
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد
وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. Amma ba'd, dear brothers and sisters in Iman, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله.
Thank you all for joining us today in this event. Inshallah, I'll try to discuss some things, some ahadith about Ziyarat, and particularly focusing on this book, the book Kamil Ziyarat, by one of our esteemed scholars of the past. The title for today's event, I actually just noticed today that both of my talks had this word navigating in them. So today's title is Kamil Ziyarat, Navigating Sacred Space Through Hadith Literature. Yesterday there was also some navigating in the title somewhere. So I don't want you to think that I'm a navigator. But inshallah, we will journey through the idea, the practice, the presence of ziyarat, something that inshallah we've all done at least once before in person, and if not, from afar. Ziyarat, as again we all know, is a pillar of Shi'i practice. It is one of the central aspects of Shi'i spirituality, of Shi'i religiosity, of the madhab of Ahlul Bayt. It is central to the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt. You cannot have the madhab of tashayyu without ziyarat, whether it is from a close or from afar. Actually, ziyarat is also part of the larger tradition of Islam as well. It's not particular to the school of the Ahlul Bayt, but other Muslims as well partake in ziyarat, and inshallah I'll briefly mention that. And inshallah as well, I'll try to sort of explore to the best of my ability the idea and the wisdom behind ziyarat. How does it transform our soul? And then, as I mentioned, I'll be focusing primarily on this book, Kamil Ziyarat, which is important not only because it is a very early source. Sometimes we might think that, over time, these practices became more sort of embellished, sometimes we say, or people might have inserted certain things. But this particular book is special because it is one of the earliest texts that we have which focuses on ziyarat and the wisdom and the barakah and the thawab of ziyarat. It's called Kamil Ziyarat wa fadluha wa thawabu dhalik. So the completion or the perfection of ziyarah or ziyarat, and its benefit, its virtue, and its blessings, the thawab of ziyarat. As I mentioned, ziyarat is an essential part of Shi'i belief and Shi'i practice. We have ahadith and books of ziyarat from the time of the Ahlul Bayt until today. And it is the various books talk about all different aspects of ziyarat. So for example, this book, Kamil Ziyarat itself, it talks about ziyarat to the different imams, but its focus is on the ziyarat of Imam Hussein. There are other books in the Shi'i literature history that talk about, for example, ziyarat of particular imams. Ziyarat of Imam Reza, for example, the ziyarat of the Ahlul Bayt, the Aima in Samarra, even ziyarat of particular ulama, certain places, certain cities, local ziyarat. And as well, some books of ziyarat in the Shi'i tradition, they talk about, for example, sharh of a particular ziyarat, Ziyarat Ashura, Ziyarat al-Jami'a al-Kabira, and so on and so forth. Other books, for example, will talk about the place of ziyarat, the time of ziyarat, and so on. In other words, my point here is to say that ziyarat is always on the top of the minds of the ulama, and they try to figure out what are the different dimensions of ziyarat that we now have to elaborate on. Again, whether it's in terms of place, whether it's in terms of time, whether it's in terms of the words that we say, the way that we behave, the adab or the adab of ziyarat, and as well, what are the recommended acts that we do, the process of getting towards the place of ziyarat. And this should give us an image about what process we are supposed to be going through, what things that we are supposed to be thinking about when we are doing ziyarat. It's not just an action that we do, but it's supposed to take over our entire being, right? Our souls, our bodies, and our bodies are supposed to reflect that change that is taking place in our souls. In particular, though, Kamil Ziyarat focuses not just on sort of the meditations of different ulama on what ziyarat could mean and the process and the behavior in ziyarat, but it focuses on the ahadith of the Ahlul Bayt. Most of this book, Kamil Ziyarat, is simply a collection of ahadith from Rasulullah until the last imams that we have words from Imam Hadi. I don't believe there's any from Imam Hassan al-Askari, but it's primarily a collection of hadith. And of course, collection of hadith tells us, it should instill in our minds that ziyarat is an essential part of our religious teaching. The words that we do in ziyarat, many of those words are taught by the Ahlul Bayt themselves. So for example, in this book, he mentions Ziyarat Ashura, for example, or Ziyarat Warith. These are words prescribed by the Ahlul Bayt. And so we are aligning our tongues with the words of the Ahlul Bayt as well. It's not something that is secondary or tertiary in our religious life. But another benefit of this book is also that it gives us a history of how ziyarat developed. For example, we might ask, well, was the ziyarat of Imam Hussein, did that become a tradition amongst the Shia, amongst the followers of the Ahlul Bayt from the time of Imam Hussein, or was it something that's developed later? This book gives us a little bit of an insight into that. And so inshallah, I'll try to expand on those few things in the short time that we have. And we are ending at what time?
So inshallah, we will be ending at 11:15 for
11,
Q&A.
Okay.
But you can take as long as you want.
Okay, inshallah. Yeah, taking as long as I want usually is not the best advice, so I'll try to take an appropriate time. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
I will begin just by giving a very brief background and significance of this book, Kamil Ziyarat, and then we will get into the meat of the topic, which is the practice of ziyarat itself. So the book is an essential and an important book. Some of our ulama, like Shaykh al-Amili and as well Sayyid al-Khoyi, Marhum Sayyid al-Khoyi, they considered this book to be a very highly authenticated book, such that the ahadith that are found in the book are sort of can be used, and the people who have been referenced in the book are accepted. And it is as well something that has been used throughout Shi'i history. So, for example, Allama Majlisi, for example, uses it in Bihar, and so on and so forth. Various copies that have been transmitted. It is a book that is reported by, or it is a book that is authored by a prominent scholar who was a student of the author of Al-Kafi, Muhammad ibn Ya'qub al-Kulaini. The author is a man by the name of Ja'far ibn Muhammad ibn Musa, and he's well known as Ibn Qulaway, a person living in the 4th century after Hijrah. And he is known for his knowledge of hadith. So he collects various ahadith from different of his teachers. One of his teachers is his own father, his own brother. Even Al-Kulaini himself are amongst his teachers. And so it is at a high level of authentication. Of course, he does include, for those who are interested, there's actually a translation that has been done. It's not the best translation, so I can't really attest for the entire thing. But it is, I guess, useful nonetheless. If you have the opportunity, it might be useful to reference that book, the translation rather. But regardless, this book is widely attested in terms of its authenticity and the references that it uses. He died again around the year 365, so a generation after Al-Kulaini and in the generation of Shaykh al-Saduq. So we're thinking now the type of person this is. He's a highly ranked scholar, very well-regarded individual. In terms of the wisdom now, we get to the main question, which is, what is the purpose of Ziyarat that we can kind of glean from this book? Various authors have understood different things. So on the one hand, for example, we see that the Ahlul Bayt have constantly, particularly during the time of Imam Muhammad al-Baqir and Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, they insisted on doing ziyarat. This idea of visiting the grave, and in particular the grave of Imam al-Hussein in Karbala. Various reasons are given for this. One, for example, in a more recent author, he says that ziyarat and the ahadith that we have, in particular in this book, seem to indicate that the Ahlul Bayt wanted to remind the Muslims, and in particular the school, the students or the members of the school of the Ahlul Bayt, of the person of Imam Hussein, of his mission, of his moral uprightness, of the political aims that the Imam had. Imam Muhammad al-Baqir and much of the life of Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq was spent during the time of the Umayyads. And then there is a transition into the Abbasid period. And so the Imams were trying to remind the Muslims, despite all of the actions of the Umayyads, and in fact, we have certain reports that the Haram of Imam Hussein was destroyed. It was first concealed, and then it was destroyed in different generations by different khulafa. So I believe Al-Mutawakkil was one of those khulafa, Mutawakkil al-Abbasi. He as well destroys, if I'm remembering correctly, he destroys the Haram of Imam Hussein. He levels it to the ground to try to erase the memory of the Imam from the collective memory of the Shia. And of course, we know that ziyarat and pilgrimage to the Imam, in particular to Imam Hussein, and to the other Ahlul Bayt, was also a source of fear for the Abbasids and the Umayyads, because this is a place where a large number of pilgrims will come and they will share ideas, and maybe they will express certain slogans and have this sort of emotional revival and emotional connection to Abu Abdullah. Anybody who knows the story of Imam Hussein, or even any of the other Ahlul Bayt, they will have a sense of injustice and a sense of oppression. And so maybe the Abbasids saw this as a political movement or as a political symbol for the Shia. And we know in history that the Abbasids were particularly afraid of the followers of the school of the Ahlul Bayt because they themselves gave the slogan that the Shia were known for. Ar-Reza min Ali Muhammad. That was the slogan of the Abbasids. And so maybe one of the reasons why the Aimma focused on this was to remind the Muslims of the memory of the Imam. But beyond this, we see that actually much of the ahadith don't really give a political position. They're not talking about politics or about society. Even they don't really talk about sort of a larger social illness that is seeping into the hearts and the minds of the Muslims. Many of the ahadith actually focus on the individual redemptive feature, the redemption that doing ziyarat can bring about. So for example, we have ahadith that say a person who does ziyarat of Imam Hussein, then Allah will forgive all of his sins or all of her sins. A person who goes and does ziyarat and maybe even who cries for the Imam outside of that ziyarat, then Allah will make Jannah required for him, wajib upon that person. In other words, He will place him in His paradise, in His good grace. And so some authors understand the action of Imam Hussein as a redemptive action, as a way for Allah to, a means by which Allah allows us to do tawbah, to repent. And connecting ourselves to the Imam has that effect. And that is attested by some of our ahadith. Again, it's not to deny that the ziyarat of Imam Hussein has a political effect, and it does. We even see that in our own day, right? There's a political dimension to the ziyarat. And there's also a redemptive dimension to the ziyarat. As I mentioned, there are ahadith that speak to that doing ziyarat or crying for the Imam has this effect on forgiving one's sins. But it seems like the ahadith also talk about something a bit higher. So it gives us a sense that when we do ziyarat, when we think about, for example, this process of doing ziyarat, what are we doing? Right? We are packing our bags. There's that very nice noha or nasheed, going to Karbala or walking to Karbala. What is it? Walking to Karbala, thank you. We're going on a journey. And this is actually something that is common amongst various religious traditions. Going on a pilgrimage, taking ourselves out of the comfort of our lives, and we move towards another place. We journey towards another location, another space. And so traveling and journeying becomes a key element in ziyarat itself. This actually is connected back to a very central theme of Islam, which is hijrah. This idea of journeying and doing pilgrimage to another place. We have it, of course, in the Hajj or in Umrah, but as well, the very essential, the very sort of touchstone of Islam is the hijrah of Rasulullah, right? The calendar of the Muslims begins with the hijrah, and the entire Muslim society, the ummah, begins and is constructed based on this idea of journeying to another place. But of course, And as the Ahlul Bayt teach us in other ahadith, hijrah is not just about a physical movement. Hijrah actually, in a deeper level, is about a moral and a spiritual journey. Spiritual journeying to a place that I am maybe not accustomed to a sort of a society, a community, a locality that changes my soul and the trajectory of my life. And this is actually a key element even in fiqh. It's called at-ta'arrub ba'd al-hijrah. When a person goes back to his old customs after he has undertaken the hijrah into Islam. So if, for example, I become Muslim, right, and I take on the appearance and the habits and the practices of Islam, I cannot revert now back to a previous practice that is dissociated or is separate from my Islamic practice. That is generally a ta'arrub ba'd al-hijrah. And so Islam now comes and changes it. We have this image. Imagine this image of, when we talk about ta'arrub, it's talking about the A'rabi, right? The Bedouin, who is constantly journeying back and forth to different places. صلوا على محمد وعلى محمد.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. ثانيا على حب الزهراء.
Sorry, I thought I had this cough under control, but it seems like it's coming back. So one example is in Surat Al Imran, ayah number 149. This is usually referenced when we are, you mentioned actually we should whisper so that we don't interrupt the other crowd. So I'll try to keep my voice a little bit lower so I can survive this talk here. Surat Al Imran, ayah number 149. Allah says, Ya ayyuhalladina amanu in tuti'u alladina kafaru yaruddukum ala a'qabikum fatanqalibu khasirin. O you who believe, if you follow those who disbelieve, those who cover up the truth, those who do kufr and do not give thanks to Allah, they will place you back, they will push you back upon your heels, and you will become amongst the losers and those who are deficient. In other words, if after we have accepted Islam, after we have entered into the community of Iman, we go back and commit those same habits that we had before, after we have journeyed into Islam, if we journey back out of Islam, then Allah says we will become amongst the khasirin, amongst those who are losers. This is talking about the mu'mineen. This is not talking about, for example, the mushrikeen. And so Islam now transforms hijrah, or journeying, traveling, as a moral requirement, as a religiously sanctioned requirement. It's not anymore a physical requirement, but now it is a moral requirement. And so it takes on this spiritual dimension. When we think about then, so on the one hand, we have this general idea of journeying, of traveling, but then we come to the idea of ziyarat. We journey towards the Imam, or even towards a honored member of the mu'mineen, a believer. And in fact, some of the ahadith do talk about the thawab of doing ziyarat of the grave of a mu'min. What we're doing is we're journeying towards a specific person. No more is it entering into a community, but it's actually being in the presence of someone, being in the presence of a human being who has devoted themselves to Allah and to the morals and the mission of Islam. And this is where, again, we're thinking not anymore about necessarily a physical journey, but a spiritual presence. there is a hadith in this book, Kamil Ziyarat, where Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq, he narrates that, for example, if you don't have the ability to go and do ziyarat up close of, for example, Imam Hussein or of the other Ahlul Bayt, how can I be in the presence of the Imam? How can I do ziyarat of the Imam? And so Imam Sadiq says, if you live far away from any of us, whether we are alive or we are past, then you should go to the highest point of your house, perform 2 rak'ats of salat, and then turn towards our grave and say salam to us, send upon us a salam. By doing this, your salam reaches us, right? So it's not even, again, on one level, Islam takes it outside of that physical journeying, but even when we're talking about being in the presence of the Imam, ziyarat becomes a spiritual presence, a spiritual journey towards the Imam. But we're still thinking of this idea of presence. What does it mean when I am in the presence or in the company of the Ahlul Bayt or even of other Muslims? When we are, in particular, when we look at the ahadith of Imam Hussein, it's a very sort of profound description. Sometimes the descriptions are a little bit difficult for us to comprehend. Not about physical presence, and not even just about me going and visiting a particular individual. The ahadith actually talk about the rest of God's creation being in line with that ziyarat, being the first ones to commit the ziyarat. So for example, there's a hadith of Imam Muhammad al-Baqir alayhi salam where he says, mankind, human beings, jinn, birds, and animals all shed tears and mourned at the martyrdom, at the shahada of Imam Hussein ibn Ali. So now, it's not just between me and the Imam, it's not just journeying towards an individual and I am an individual, it's all of God's creation aligning themselves with the Imam, with this individual. In another hadith, in this book, Kamil Ziyarat, it mentions, on the day of Ashura, 4,000 angels came down to fight for Imam Hussein, and they were led by a specific angel called Mansur, but Imam Hussein did not accept this, did not grant them the permission to fight. They returned to Allah to seek permission. When they returned back, Imam Hussein had already been martyred. So we get the sense that even the basic connection of human beings, of this world, to the higher realms, to Allah Himself, is in line with and aligning itself with the place, the grave, and the person of Imam Hussein. In other ahadith, Allah comes and gives ta'ziyah, comes and gives His condolences to Rasulullah. Allah Himself gives condolences to Rasulullah for what is going to happen in the future. We think about space, we think about my individual presence versus the presence of Allah's creation, and we might even think about Allah Himself as aligning His entire creation and as focusing an attention to the grave of Imam Hussein. Just one other hadith. It's not just, we think about, for example, what is it that can have presence? Right? We usually think about conscious beings. Beings that can, say for example, that have souls, that can understand, that can reflect. But in some ahadith, it says, in one hadith in particular, it says, I heard from Amir al-Mu'mineen, alayhi salam, in Ruhba, where he recites this verse, Surat Ad-Dukhan, ayah number 29. فَمَا بَكَتْ عَلَيْهِمُ السَّمَاءُ And the entire, neither the heaven nor the earth shed a tear over them, nor were they given a respite. And Amir al-Mu'mineen is using this ayah to refer to even the non-sentient beings, the heavens and the earth, right? Every part of God's creation now is redirecting itself towards the Imam. I just want to mention this last point, and then I will move on to the next issue, which is that even the jinn, right? In one hadith, actually, towards the end of the book, it mentions that, for example, there was every part of God's creation orients itself and does ziyarat of Imam Hussein when Imam Hussein was killed, every part of it, except for three things. The Dimashq, people of Basra, al-Basra, the enemies of Imam Ali in the Battle of Jamal, and then Alu Uthman. So these three groups were the ones who separated themselves or who did not direct themselves towards ziyarat of Imam Hussein. Every other part of God's creation directs itself towards Imam Hussein. Even the jinn. Usually when we think about the jinn, they are sort of an evil creature, right? A dark creature that we can't see, that is invisible, that is hidden from our sight. And usually they are causing some sort of evil in the world. In one set of reports, they're not necessarily ahadith of the Ahlul Bayt, but they're still mentioned in this book. One is, I believe, from Salama. She says that when Imam Hussein was killed, there was a report that two jinn, or a group of jinn, came and they visited the grave of the Imam. And I mention this because sometimes the jinn actually have good lines of poetry. And so, maybe we can take this as an opportunity to recite these lines. Aya aynaya fanhamala bijuhdin faman yabki ala shuhada'i ba'di ala rahtin تقودهم المنايا إلى متجبر من نسل عبدي. O my eyes, shed plentiful tears. Who will mourn over the martyrs? Shed tears over a group who are being led towards their deaths by a tyrant who is from the progeny of a slave. Right? So even jinn have the sense to go and do ziyarat of the Imam. Who does not have the sense? Again, those three groups. And if we are amongst those groups, then according to some ahadith, our iman, the very basis of our salvation, the very source of our connection to the larger community, that iman is maybe deficient, right? So if a person does not encourage himself or does not feel his soul yearning for ziyarat, then his iman should even be placed under question. And so ziyarat doesn't, in other words, just fulfill a physical presence, a political movement, or even a spiritual presence, an individual's spiritual presence in the face of another spiritual presence. But in fact, it is a means for me, an individual, to align myself with all of God's creation. And for me to connect myself directly to the very purpose of that creation. And that's why, according to the ahadith, that's why the ziyarat of Imam Hussein is so vital for not just my religious life, but even my spiritual and my eternal life. It's not just, for example, a practice that I do, but it actually functions to change my entire soul, changes the trajectory of who I become. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
And this is particularly for the ziyarat of Imam Hussein. Of course, the ziyarat of many of our other imams have a very high distinction. In fact, in this book, it mentions that, for example, the ziyarat of Imam Reza or the Aimma in Baghdad and in other locations, they have the same value and the same effect as the ziyarat of Imam Hussein. But what's distinct, though, is that many of these descriptions are given about Imam Hussein in particular. So on the one hand, we have different places of ziyarat, right? A whole landscape where we go and journey and we do ziyarat. But at the same time, there is a topography. There are valleys and then there are mountains. And those mountains have a higher spiritual effect, not necessarily because that person has a distinction above the other Ahlul Bayt. So for example, we don't say that Imam Hussein has a fadila over Imam Hassan or Imam Amirul Mu'mineen, or even Lady Fatima or Rasulullah himself. But the focus is on Imam Hussein. The turbat of Imam Hussein, it has a special power, right? So we are transforming our soul as God has transformed his entire creation. And there's effects of that transformation in the very physical things of that place. The turbat is transformed now and it has healing power. The shrine underneath the shrine of Imam Hussein, it has religious power, right? We can do a complete salat under that shrine, just like we can do it in Hajj, just like we can do it in specific places in our religious map. But as well, it seems to, Imam Hussein's ziyarat seems to have a special power beyond other places that we might go and visit. So again, there are caveats. Some ahadith do say that, for example, there is a similar value that the ziyarat of other Ahlul Bayt have, but then there is a increased distinction and increased thawab that's given for Imam Hussein beyond other places. Even beyond, we're thinking about how ziyarat transforms my the physical world, the spiritual world, but even it gets a distinction, right? We're thinking about a topography. It even goes beyond the normal places of sanctity of the presence of God, like the Hajj. So we have particular ahadith that say that doing ziyarat of Imam Hussein with the proper awareness of the Imam is even worth more than 1,000 Hajj or 1,000 Umrah. Right? So we're actually changing the calculation, the equation. This is even worth, you can even get closer to God. This has more spiritual power, this place and this person has more spiritual power for you to get closer to Allah than those other places that other people might distinguish in their own minds. Right? So the topography gets a little bit clearer for us. But each individual, it's again not making a distinction or not saying something special about Imam Hussein versus the Kaaba, or we shouldn't conflate these things, in other words. But other places also have a special power. So we now have a better sense of our spiritual landscape. We have hopefully a better sense of the effect of those practices, of those rituals. What does it mean for me to now go and be in the presence of the Imam, and for me to have presence when I am in that place, for me to do ziyarat with that proper understanding, and how that can actually change my being. The second part of that I'd like to focus on, and I will end with this, is the history. As I mentioned, one of the benefits of this book is that it kind of describes for us how ziyarat as a practice also began to develop amongst the Shia. In fact, one of the interesting things that we have from this book is that, of course, it starts with the ziyarat of Rasulullah. So according to hadith, both of Shia and of the other schools of Islam. Rasulullah encouraged Muslims, whenever they come to do Hajj, whenever they come to visit the city of Mecca, to come to the city of Medina as well and to do ziyarat of himself. There's a hadith that says, whoever comes to Mecca and doesn't come to Medina, faqad jafani, he has sort of done an injustice to me. And on the day of judgment, this is Rasulullah speaking, on the day of judgment, I will do an injustice to him. I will sort of avoid that person. My shafa'ah, my intercession is not going to reach that individual. And again, this is narrated from both schools of thought. It has a sort of a question mark in the larger Muslim community, but it is a practice nonetheless that dates back to a very early period. On the other level, of course, everybody accepts the ziyarat of Rasulullah, but then we also have the beginnings of a process, a ritual of ziyarat, even during the time of Imam Zainul Abidin. As we are all familiar, the first Za'ir of Imam Hussein was Jabir ibn Abdullah al-Ansari, who comes to ziyarat on the 40th day, as it is commonly mentioned, after the events of Ashura. There's another hadith mentioned in this book where from Imam Zainul Abidin, who asks one of his companions, Zaida, who says that, I've heard that you go and make ziyarat. So now we're seeing that even during the time of Imam Zainul Abidin, this process of ziyarat is becoming familiar for certain individuals. Imam Zainul Abidin asks him, O Zaida, I have been made aware that you perform the ziyarat of the grave of Aba Abdullah al-Hussein on certain occasions. Zaida, this companion of the Imam, says, yes, that's true. The Imam says, why do you do this even though you are held in high honor by your governor? In other words, if you do this, know that there are going to be maybe political or financial repercussions for you because you're going to be maybe blacklisted for this action. And then he responds, a man who does not look kindly upon those who love us, the Ahlul Bayt, or those who give preference to us over others, or those who mention our attributes, or those who fulfill any of his obligations towards us. So the Imam is basically saying that he commends him for doing all of these, for going and doing ziyarat. But it doesn't actually become a practice. And we see this in the words of Imam Muhammad al-Baqir and Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq. It doesn't actually become a common practice until the time of Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq. So there's a report where Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq is reporting this from his father, Imam Muhammad al-Baqir. He says, he asks a person who was going to do a ziyarat. He says, to whose ziyarat? This person says, I'm going to do ziyarat. And he says, to whose ziyarat are you going? And whom do you seek to please by going to this ziyarat? The person says, I'm going to do ziyarat of Allah. This is a man who came from a far away place. And then Imam Muhammad al-Baqir responds by saying, a person who establishes a salat behind the grave of Imam Hussein, seeking the nearness of Allah, will meet him on the day of judgment, shining brightly, so brightly that the light emanating from them will cover everything that they see. In another hadith from Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, he is asked by one of his female companions, actually, a person by the name of Sa'id al-Ahmasiyya. He says, she asks him, she says that I'm getting ready to go and do ziyarat of the Shuhada of Uhud. So she was in the presence of the Imam in the city of Medina. And she says, I'm going to go and visit the people, the Shuhada of Uhud, Hamza and the others who were killed in that battle. And then the Imam asks her, what prevents you from performing the ziyarat of Sayyid al-Shuhada? What's interesting is this female companion, she says, who is Sayyid al-Shuhada? She's thinking Sayyid al-Shuhada is Hamza. The Imam says, Hussein ibn Ali. I asked, what's the reward for performing his ziyarat? The Imam says, the reward is a purified Hajj and an Umrah, as well as this much reward. And the Imam gestures towards the reward. With the teachings of Imam Sadiq, and after Imam Sadiq, the rest of the Ahlul Bayt begins with Imam Baqir. This becomes a sort of a ritual practice amongst the members of the Ahlul Bayt. And as I mentioned, becomes so common, becomes such a common practice that during the Abbasid era, it becomes even a question or a source of concern for the Khulafa. So much so that some of the Khulafa are moved to go and destroy the Haram of the Imam. And then, as I mentioned, the practice of ziyarat gets expanded. At the end of this text, talks about the ziyarat, for example, of the Aimma buried in Baghdad, Imam Musa al-Kadhim, and then as well Imam Muhammad ibn Ali al-Jawad, and then also the later Imams of the city of Samarra, and then even in the city of Qum. I will conclude here by just mentioning this final point. Sometimes we think that, for example, what is the sort of the wisdom that a person can go through his entire life and can commit all of these sins, and then just by doing ziyarat of Imam Hussein, then all of those sins are forgotten. He can repent to sort of the deathbed repentance, right? That sometimes we might hear about. You go and do a ziyarat for me. Person pays another person. That person goes and does ziyarat on his behalf. And then all of the oppression, all of the injustices that he has done throughout his entire life, all of those will be forgiven, right? Sometimes we have that question. Well, on the one hand, of course, Allah is just and He is wise. He's not going to negate the injustices that a person does. But we shouldn't also be blind to the effect and the function of ziyarat. A function which really goes to the very basis of the purpose of Islam, which is to transform our soul to be in the presence of Allah, to be able to communicate with Allah and to change our soul so that we can accept those teachings of Islam in a deeper way. It changes our disposition to accept those that spiritual and moral message. And ziyarat allows us to do this by moving, physically and spiritually moving, by being in the presence of the Imam. Our soul now is changed. It's not about, for example, sometimes we might think that it's about how much information that we have or how much we believe in certain things, how much, say, shahada that I do. Rather, ziyarat gives us a sense of the importance of actual physical and spiritual presence. And this allows us to change the disposition and allows us to open our heart to something deeper, something mysterious. It is a bit mysterious. How is it that I am going and speaking to someone who seems dead, who seems like he has passed away? How is this connection and communication happening? I'm talking to the Imam from afar. It is mysterious, but ziyarat allows us to open ourselves to that mystery. I will end there. Thank you all for your attention. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.